Greetings and welcome to A Day in the Life. This is program number 101 in our series, and I'm delighted to be able to thank our sponsors. Our season sponsors are Kathy Bales and Michelle Dishaw of RBC Dominion Securities, Bales Dishaw Wealth Management, and we are very grateful to them for their continuing support of this program. And we also want to thank our program supporter for this particular show, Greg Rice. Thanks to Greg for sponsoring this particular program. Well, this is a very special edition of A Day in the Life because we are very honored to have as our guest the Right Honorable Paul Martin, former Prime Minister of Canada. Welcome, Mr. Martin.
Well, Mr. Hacker, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, we are too. And just to explain to our audience, we're going to have a quick look at your background, and I don't know how we'll cover all the many achievements in your lifetime, but I know that our audience will be interested in some of the things you've done since you left the formal political scene, so we'll be dwelling on that perhaps in the second half of our program. But to begin, I'm fascinated by what it would be like to grow up in the home of Paul Martin Sr. Your father was a distinguished Canadian politician, community leader. Tell us what influence your dad had on you.
Well, my dad had a huge influence on me. The fact is that while he was a very busy man, obviously, we were very close. So we discussed an awful lot, and he had a great knack to speak to a very young person like myself, but not patronize me. And there's no doubt that given the nature of his jobs, I got a chance to see a lot, and I think I succeed. I really am benefited enormously. I can tell you a couple of stories about it if you like.
I'd love to hear them.
Well, I'll tell you one that doesn't make me look great, but my father was obviously a member of Parliament when I was born. And then he was Minister of Health and Welfare, Minister of Foreign Affairs. But even when he was the Minister of Health and Welfare, he was very actively involved in foreign issues. If you're a member of Parliament and the post office opens up a new office in your riding, especially if you've got a number of small towns, that is a magnificent thing. And of course, the MP will takes full credit for it.
Of course.
So the story that they tell, when I was about 14, I guess it was, my dad was going to take me to New York. I was going to see the United Nations. He was the head of the Canadian delegation. But before we could go, one of the smaller centers around Windsor, which is where my dad was the member, got a new post office, and they were having a big opening. And of course, my father was going to be at it. So I went with them. And the fact is that person after person got up and talked about what a wonderful person my father was, because he brought the post office. And my father took credit for it. Whether he should have or not is a different thing. He certainly took credit for that post office. And then we got in a plane. We flew to New York. And we went to the United Nations. Now, when the United Nations really got going, the initial countries were all there, but an awful lot of the newer countries, these had been colonized powers that had gotten independence and everything else, were not admitted to the United Nations. And my dad led the fight to bring the new nations in. And he actually broke the freeze on that was there. And so we got there, and they're going to admit these new nations. And my dad snuck me into the General Assembly, actually. And I sat there. I suspect somebody's going to criticize my dad for that, but that was many, many years ago. And I sat there when member after member stood up and praised my father for breaking this. So I had been the day before at Bell River, where they talked to at the post office, they talked to how good my dad was, and then I went to the United Nations, and they all stood up and said what a wonderful thing my dad was. And apparently the press came up to me, none of whom had been in Windsor the night before, and said to my dad's son, well, young man, what do you think about all those speeches in favor of your father? To which my answer was, I thought the speeches in Bell River were much better. So, there you go. That's part of my life.
Yeah. And in some ways, for your father's political career, the speeches in Bell River were more important too.
I don't think there was any doubt about that.
Now, I read your autobiography, Hell or High Water, My Life in and Out of Politics, which you wrote in 2008. And there's a wonderful story about your mother there. But first of all, tell us a bit about your mother. And then I want you to tell us the story about your mother's reaction to your father when they were out for a walk one day, when she sat down on the sidewalk in Windsor. Do you remember that story?
Yes, I do. My mother was just a wonderful woman, and none of what my father done marked her at all. I mean, she was her own woman, and she loved life, and she was just tremendous. And my father, a little bit like a lot of politicians, every so often begin to sort of take on a certain amount of importance within themselves. And they were walking down. They were down one of the main drives, Willette Street in Windsor. And my father was, people would come up to my father and say, Mr. Martin, how are you? And my father's chest got bigger and bigger and bigger. And my mother thought he was just taking too much of this in. And she tried to figure out how in heaven's name she could bring my father back to earth. And then what she finally decided, she got to the corner of Willette and another street, and she sat down on the curb. She just sat there on the curb, and people started coming up and what was going on. And my dad was saying, Nell, come on, you've got to get up. And she basically then told him after about 5 minutes of sitting there, I'm not moving from here unless you basically stop feeling so full of yourself. And my dad had to give in. She got up, they walked away, and my dad returned to normal.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that with us. I want to just touch on another element of your family background, and that is that your family coped with a lot of health challenges, your father, your sister, and yourself. I'm not sure Canadians are aware of the challenges that your family has faced.
Well, my dad had polio as a very young boy, and in fact, all of his life was paralyzed. He could barely see out of one eye, and he had a very bad arm, and and obviously he had the life of a child. At that time, he came from a very poor family, but it was his brothers and sisters who helped him get along, and then obviously things happened. He succeeded, and then I ended up at the age of 8 having polio. Windsor at that time, anybody who was from southwestern Ontario who would be my age would remember the huge epidemics of polio. It was every single year, and my mother was forever worried about it. And then all of a sudden, one day, I got polio, and I had the kind of polio that would have I would have been, if I hadn't survived, an iron lung. And so obviously that had a huge effect on our family. My father was very active even after he left with the March of Dimes, and I have been involved with the March of Dimes. The difference between the epidemic of polio and, of course, what we're going through now is people anticipated that it wasn't the huge surprise. But most people my age, you look a little younger, so I'm not sure about you, Mr. Hacker, but most people my age will remember full well that in every class there were kids with braces. It was a pretty standard thing. Mm-hmm. And that had an enormous amount of effect on my dad as the Minister of Health and Welfare. It's the reason he wanted to be the Minister of Health and Welfare, and it's the reason that essentially he brought in the national health care system.
Yes, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. Your sister also suffered some health problems.
Well, yes, she did, and she had a very deep breathing problem. And she eventually she passed away a number of years ago, and as a result of that.
Now, your early education was in part dictated by your father's living in Windsor, but working in Ottawa. So you went to middle school in Ottawa, and you attended a high school in Ottawa, and then you went to St. Michael's College, and you were in a fraternity at St. Michael's College, Psi Upsilon. What?
Yes, well, it was a fraternity. St. Michael's College is, as far as I'm concerned, the most important of all the colleges or universities at the University of Toronto. And so the fraternities were actually the University of Toronto fraternities.
Yeah. And while in high school, or at least at university, you became a member of a certain political club that may have had some bearing on your father's position at the time.
Well, you're talking about the Liberal Club.
Yes.
Yes. Not surprisingly. Not surprisingly.
Now you then went to Canada's finest law school.
Good for you.
Something that you and I share in common.
University of Toronto.
That's right. And you were called to the bar in 1966. But you say in your book that you were determined not to practice law. Why was that?
Well, I went to law school because, to be quite honest, I didn't know what to do, and I was looking for what is the best background, and I guess it might have been my dad who told me law, and I enjoyed law school, and then after that I became a member of the bar, but I'd always wanted to go to. I'd wanted to work in third world development. That had been my ambition. And I was admitted to the bar, and I'd never given any thought to business. But there was a man by the name of Morris Strong, whom you may know. Morris Strong is one of the great Canadians. He was Canada's first environmentalist. He was tremendously interested in third world development. And he said to me at one point, after I'd been admitted to the bar, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I want to go to Africa and work in third world development." And he looked at me straight in the eye and he said, "Yeah, you're right. That's exactly what Africa needs, is another fresh-faced young lawyer." And so I sort of said, "Well, how can I do it?" He said, "Go into business and get a business background, and then you can go to Africa." And so how will I do that? He was at that time the president of Power Corporation of Canada. And he said, "Come and be my assistant." And I went to work for Power, went to work for Morris Strong. Morris Strong left actually to go back into third world development, and not long after that. But it turns out I had a bit of a knack for business, and I really enjoyed it. So I stayed in business up until I ran.
Now, at that time, the Canada Steamship lines was controlled by Power Corp. And is that how you got your introduction to the CSL?
Yes, it is. I had a series of summer jobs as being a deckhand. I actually worked on ocean ships and ships up in the far north. But I loved ships. Power Corp controlled Canada Steamship Lines, and really at a relatively young age, I was 33, I was made president of Canada Steamship Lines. That's where I'd spent most of my time. And then what happened was Power Corporation decided that they were going to sell Canada Steamship Lines. They were looking at a number of other investments, and they decided they were going to sell. They called me as the president of the company and said, we want you to help us sell it. I said to them, I didn't want to help you sell it. I want to buy it. Paul Demer, I said, "But you don't have enough money." And I said, "That's because you didn't pay me enough." And and in any event, he said, "Okay, I will. If you can find a partner, then I will. I'll negotiate with you." And I did have a friend who was in the shipping business. I walked across the street, and in about 15 or 20 minutes, I put together the deal. I said, "I think that if we can sit down and negotiate." It was a very, very hard, you can understand, I had worked for Power Corp. It was a very hard negotiation. But eventually we bought the company, borrowed a lot of money, and it was one of the largest leverage buyouts in Canadian history at that time. And but anyway, I bought my partner out eventually, and now it's in the family. I don't have to do with it, but my sons certainly do.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Now, politics obviously played a big part in your entire life, but in terms of your own involvement, in 1984, the Liberal Party suffered a defeat, and there was some talk about perhaps drafting you as a leader. You did then run. Your first election was 88?
88. Yes, it was 88. John Turner was the leader. There was no thought of leadership. I had always said, I had said to you before, I wanted to do something. I wanted to be in business, but business was really supposed to be the jumping off spot for me to do something else. And the time had come. I was in my 40s, my late 40s. And so I decided to run in the 88 election. It had nothing to do with leadership. It had everything to do with there comes a time to pay back. Mm-hmm. And I ran in that election. The Liberals lost the election, and Jean Chrétien became the Prime Minister. And then the next election in '93, we won, and I became Minister of Finance, primarily because of my business background.
You were a candidate in the '88 leadership convention.
Yes, I was.
And then in '93, my understanding is that you co-authored what has become known as the Red Book. And the Liberals won a landslide majority in that '93 election. Let's talk about your time as finance minister. Certainly until you became prime minister, that was, I think, what you were best known for, turning the economy around during the difficult '90s. You were faced with a challenging budget in. Right off the bat, Canada had one of the largest deficits in the G7 at the time. Can you tell us in layman's terms, so that we'll all understand it, how you viewed the problem and what you thought the solution was?
Well, we won in '93. I had to present a budget within about 2 months later in 1994. And there was no way within that very short period of time that I could produce a budget that would deal with what had to be done. And so we brought forth a budget that indicated that we were going to be making cuts, that we were going to be dealing with the deficit, but that it was obviously well short of what was required. But that meant I had a year to prepare the budget that was going to follow. And the fundamental problem that we really had was that, first of all, Canada had a very large national debt. And we, among all of the countries, we had a lot of that national debt was in foreign hands. In fact, Italy had a higher national debt than we did, but it was all in Italian hands. Ours was mostly in foreign hands. And that meant that we were totally subject to the whim of the market in terms of interest rates. And the Wall Street Journal said that Canada was a banana republic, and that it just talked about it. Mexico got in a little bit of trouble. And as a result of that, when one country gets into trouble with a bad balance sheet, everybody else gets affected. And our interest rates started to go through the roof. And so I essentially went across the country talking to Canadians as the Minister of Finance, but telling them that this was going to be a very tough budget. But my main goal, and I explained it to Canadians, I wasn't looking for a prettier balance sheet. And this was not to be austerity the way the Europeans were doing it with their, but I said the only way we are going to protect our social programs is if, in fact, we get our balance sheet in order, because if we don't do that, our interest rates are going to go through the roof and we will not be able to do it. And that's when I brought in the '95 budget. And the '95 budget essentially, for the first time in 25 years, dealt with the deficit. Within a relatively short period of time, in terms of years, we were back into surplus. And the purpose of it, and I said this to Canadians, I said we're going to start to bring about the deficit down slowly, but we are going to bring the deficit down. We are going to ultimately eliminate the deficit. And when we do, we are going to basically put that money back into the social programs that we needed. And that's why one of the first things that I did when I became Prime Minister was I brought in the largest healthcare budget in Canada's history. And it was a way of paying back for what Canadians had allowed me to do as Minister of Finance.
By 1998, you were able to balance the budget, which had only happened a couple of times in 4 decades. That's quite a remarkable turnaround, sir.
Well, it was due to Canadians. I mean, I went out across the country explaining to Canadians, and and Canadians rose. Was important. I watched the Europeans make mistake after mistake. I made no promises that we did not keep. In fact, I underpromised, and that was really very important. And at the same time, my colleagues, cabinet ministers whose budgets I was cutting, cooperated very much with me, and the Prime Minister supported me.
One of the things you did was to reform the Canada Pension Plan, which had an effect on everyone. Can you just? I think that was an example to me of the benefit of public consultation and buy-in. Well,
there was this is one of the things that happens when you're doing this kind of thing. People do come in a private room. When we took office and we had this terrible deficit, the Canada Pension Plan had an unfunded liability that was greater than the national debt. And what that really meant, because at the time, the way the pension plan worked, it was the premiums. It was good go as you go. So that what it meant was that young people at that time were paying premiums for their pensions that were greater than what I had ever paid. And I was going to get a much better pension than they were because the pension plan was in terrible shape. So, and I think this is a really important point. You think about this, in that 95 budget that you talked about, I cut transfers to the provinces. There's no reason why the finance ministers and the other provinces had to think that I was a wonderful person. And then what I did after that, I called them because it's a joint federal provincial plan. And I had to say to all the provinces, guess what? I'm coming to you with the idea, which is we've got to put the Canada Pension Plan back into shape, which means that we're going to have to make certain cuts in the benefits and we're going to charge more in premiums. How would you like to do that? All for the benefit of people who weren't yet born. And I got to say that I think it was a really important point in Canadian federal provincial relations. All of those provincial finance ministers said, we have to do it. And we did it.
In December of 2001, you received a very significant recognition. You were named to the World Business Forum's Dream Cabinet, along with U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell and UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Pretty heady company you're keeping, Mr. Prime Minister.
I got to know, I met Colin Powell, but I got to know Kofi Annan well. And I had, later on in life, I had the occasion to call on him. When I left government, which is a euphemism for saying when I lost the election as Prime Minister, Kofi Annan called me, and he asked me if I wanted to work in Africa, and I said yes, and I did. I worked in Africa for about a year and a half, and it was a tremendous experience. I worked with the African Development Bank, and then I worked on environmental matters with the Brits.
We'll explore that more in a moment because I do want to touch on that. There was a leadership convention in the fall of 2003. You won 93% of the delegate votes. I suspect that that's some kind of a record. And then you were sworn in as Canada's 21st Prime Minister in December of 2003. There's something significant about the flag that you held at that time.
It was a flag that was at half-mast when my father passed away.
And that's what you held at your swearing-in ceremony. That's very, very touching. Your father had made several runs at the leadership of the Liberal Party as well. A bit of a family dynasty there. I want to just talk about some of the highlights of your time in government. One of the significant achievements you made was the changes you made in equalization payments, which you referred to earlier. That was to ensure uniformity of public service. You also legalized same-sex marriage, just the fourth country in the world to do that. What kind of pushback was there on that?
Well, within the Liberal Party and within among the members, because it's the members that had to vote on it, there were some members who were not happy with it. But to be fair, the vast majority of the Liberal members supported it, and there was some pushback among the opposition, but it was the same thing. There were members who were for it, members who were against it. That particular time in Parliament was actually not a bad time in Parliament. The debates that took place were they weren't the kinds of vicious debates that you saw, and so that on that issue, and there a number of Liberal members of cabinet, people like Sheila Copps, people like Anne McClellan, as an example, had prepared the way. But I'm very proud of what we did.
Right. You mentioned your healthcare plan, a 10-year, $40 billion plan to improve healthcare, and reduction of wait times was also one of your priorities in your time in office. One of the things that you signed, the early learning childcare agreement with the provinces, was a bit of a foreteller of what we'll talk about later in terms of what you're doing now. But I know you were very proud of the Kelowna Accord in November of 2005. For those who don't remember or are too young to have known, tell us the significance of the Kelowna Accord.
Sure, I will. Just before I do, I felt very strongly and feel very strongly about childcare, and that if you take a look at today and what has happened following COVID, and what it's just so clear that a childcare program is absolutely crucial if you're going to build a strong country. I don't think there's much of a distinction to be made, by the way, between social policy and economic policy. Good social policy is very strong economic policy, whether it be healthcare or whether it be education. And I think that childcare fits in with that. And so Ken Dryden and I was the Prime Minister. Ken Dryden was the man who took the responsibility to go across the country and develop the program. Mm-hmm. I don't think I answered your question.
Well, no, thank you. Because I know how important that is to you. We'll talk more about that. The Kelowna Accord was the other thing that we touched on, and I wondered if you might just explain the significance of that in the evolution of relations with our Indigenous community.
Well, I think that Canadians know that the underfunding of healthcare, the residential schools, and the attempt to use education to destroy the Indigenous cultures of this country, the cost to obviously to Indigenous people, but the cost to the country of that history, that misuse of colonization, I think has done so much damage, and that we simply had to deal with it. Now the question then is, how do you do it? And it required both the federal government and the provinces. But instead of doing what governments had always done, is to simply say, this is the answer, here's the answer, First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, take it. What we did is I asked to meet with Phil Fontaine, who was the national chief at the time, and I said, look, would you meet with the head of the Inuit, meet with the head of the Métis, and basically you decide the agenda. We're going to have a meeting, we're going to deal with all of this, but it's your agenda. And they came back, they said, here is the agenda. And so what we did is we had a federal provincial meeting, a set of meetings, and we basically set out the objectives of the negotiation, and then we set up tables that would negotiate this. And just to give another example, we said to them, to the First Nations, how do you want us to proceed? You determine it. And they said, we need to take a break every so often to go back and consult with our communities. I said, that's what we're going to do. So it took us 18 months to negotiate the Kelowna Accord. But what it was Ralph Goodale was the Minister of Finance, put $5 billion onto the table for a 5-year period. It would be continuously spent after that 5 years. And basically to deal with the real problems in housing, the problems in clean water, healthcare, and education. And it also, an essential part of it, was the apology by us as the government on behalf of all Canadians to the Indigenous people of the land for what had happened. And unfortunately, in relatively shortly thereafter, we lost the election, and the government that came in, thank God, kept the apology and made the apology that we had set up, but they scooped the $5 billion, and consequently, the money that would have set things right would have been started to be spent, and it was not there. Fortunately, the current government has basically picked up on that funding.
Mm-hmm. Many things that you achieved during the time you're the Prime Minister. One of the things that I understand you're proud of is the promotion of the G20.
Very much so. We all know what the G7 is. The G7 is the 7 most powerful countries economically. And when I became the finance minister, I went to my first G7 finance ministers meeting. And but I know, this was supposed to be the 7 most powerful countries. Well, China was not involved. India was not involved. So many of the really powerful countries. And I raised this at about my second meeting. So here I am, a brand new finance minister. And I'm basically saying, hey, look, this is not right. We've got to create an alternate organization that will include the real, all of the powers. Nobody was represented from Latin America, as an example. Very few from Asia. Nobody from Africa. And but I couldn't get it. I couldn't get it through the G7, and I was a new finance minister. It didn't work. And then what happened in not too long thereafter, a couple of years, what called the Asian crisis occurred, which is when a number of Asian countries got into difficulty. Thailand, as an example, what they were doing, borrowing in American dollars, short, lending long, and then not be able to handle it. And there was a huge crisis. The largest devaluation of the Brazilian currency, as an example. So what happened was the G7 we met, and we told those countries, the Asian countries and Latin America, what they should do. And the next thing I know, we have an emergency meeting of the G7 in which the Asian countries told us to stick it right in. Basically, they said, what are you doing? You're having a meeting telling us what to do, and you don't even invite us to the meeting where you negotiate it out. On the way out of that meeting, I tapped Larry Summers, who was the U.S. Treasury Secretary at the time and a very good friend, on the shoulder. I said, we better go. Can we go talk? And I said, you remember when I raised this idea of a G20 a couple of years ago? And he said, yeah. I said, look, this is clear. We have to do it. We are not simply creditable. And he agreed with me. And so what happened is that Larry and I went back, and we went back to the G7 countries, and then we went out. I met with the Chinese as an example on that. But I'm very clear. Look, if I had not tapped the U.S. Treasury Secretary and said, come be my partner, we would not have gotten it through. At this point, the United States was highly, highly respected. And so we between the two of us, we pulled it off. The G20 was created at the finance minister's level. And it has proved itself. Now it's having a rough time right now, to be quite honest, the G20. But it's the body. When I became Prime Minister, I tried to get it elevated to the leaders level. Everybody was in favor of it, except the President of the United States, George Bush. He wasn't against it. He just said, now is not the timing. And so I said, well, it's going to happen during a crisis. And he said, yes, it did. And that's exactly what happened. I was out of office when it went to the leaders level, but it was at the 2008 financial crisis.
Now, in 2006, there was a federal election, and your party did not carry the day in that election, but you stayed on for a couple of years as a backbencher. And during that time, you devoted a lot of your time to what have become your major interests in the years since, improving educational opportunities for our Indigenous community and your interests in Africa. I'm wondering if we might move, because I'm very interested in what you're doing now. And can you introduce us to the Martin Family Initiative?
Yeah, just to say, I stayed on in Parliament until such time as the party had chosen a new leader, and then I stepped down, and that's when Kofi Annan called me, and I got involved in Africa. But I basically said, look, we have if I could just tell you another story. When I was in Africa, I was actively working in Central Africa, and essentially one of the African governments was supposed to really make some changes, and it didn't. And I was very close to the World Bank at this time, and I was in there pushing for these changes. And I finally met with the Prime Minister of this country and his cabinet, and I said to him, I said, look, I've never seen such misery as exists in some of your villages. This simply makes no sense. I said this in front of his cabinet, and his cabinet, as you can tell, was shocked. And then a young man repeated something into his ear, and the young man, the Prime Minister said, this young man wants to say something to you. And he said to me, Mr. Martin, I went to Canadian University, and I did do some work up north, and I've been in some of your First Nations communities. And Mr. Martin, when you say that you've never seen such misery as you've seen in my country, I would suggest you visit your country.
Wow.
Yeah, and he was right. I mean, and I knew he was right, and there was no doubt about it. And so but that was when I said, listen, I'm coming home. This has been my interest since I was 6 years old, and I really do believe in the future of Indigenous Canada. I think that the strength of the Indigenous cultures, whether they be Métis, whether you be First Nations or Inuit, the position that they take on, for instance, they recognized same-sex marriage, all of these issues long before we did. Their view on climate, the richness of their culture, and the fact is that colonization was just an immoral imposition on them, and we had to make it better. We had to make it better in terms of healthcare and education, but they have the skills to do it. We just have to work with them. And so I basically came home and said, okay, this is where I'm going to devote the rest of my life. And we set up a foundation. I brought in a number of people, friends, to help us work. And I can give you some of the programs if you're interested in.
Love to hear about.
Okay, I'll give you the first program that we started was, one of the things is that they basically got to get involved in the economy, get involved in business. Every high school in the country have high school business courses. There is no such thing as a high school business course with Indigenous culture. There's no such thing as a high school business course that takes into account Indigenous communities. So what we did is we did a pilot project at a school, a fly-in school for reserves on Hudson's Bay. And we essentially, as a result of that, learned how to develop business courses that do take into account Indigenous cultures, Indigenous economic opportunities, because we did it not on our own. We did it with Indigenous business people, with basically theirs. And then we started, after that one, we took that business course, we started it then at a school in Winnipeg, and we're now in 50 schools across the country, 100% Indigenous classes on business. And it's huge success. You're getting young people coming out saying, we want to do this. And then a number of chiefs and councils came to us and said, can you do it? Can you do a business course for people who are dropping out of school? dropping up because maybe they'll go back to school, or maybe they'll learn it if they develop a trade. And so then we have another course, which is Indigenous economic development, and it's now taking off across the country. And so that. I could go on and on that, but that's one. The other one is, if you can't read or write by the age of grade 3, then you're not going to graduate from high school, let alone primary school. And so many young people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, cannot read by the end of grade 3. There was a program then started in Ontario some 30 years ago. I went to Kathleen Wynne, who at that time was very active in Ontario, and I said, "Can we have the course?" She said, "Yes, we got the course." And we've introduced it. We're now in 18 Indigenous schools spread across the country, with using literacy as the focus. And they're using it as the focus to improve their schooling. And it's working really well. And then the last program that I would talk to you is about is our early years program. Fundamentally, the youngest and the fastest growing population in our country are Indigenous people. And the Cindy Blackstock, who is a leading advocate for the Indigenous people, will tell you that part of the problem is that they have sometimes very tough childhoods. And so what we really did is we said, okay, how can we work on this? And what we went into a community, and we said, we're going to develop a course whereby community mothers can help young mothers along. So essentially we go into this in the community, we advertised for community mothers who want to be able to teach, to help young mothers. And we put together a whole team. Then we got a supervisor from the community. This is all community development. We report to the Community Health Authority, and we developed a program that one of these advisors knocks on the door and says, "Hello, Sally, can I help you?" And they worked with these young mothers. And we spend 5 years with the young mothers as they go on. And it's been a huge success. And as a result of which, then 4 or 5 adjacent communities basically said, we all want to come together. So we did it there. And we're now getting, I won't go into it because we will be making the announcement, but we're getting calls all the time by other communities. But the important thing to understand is we developed a program with the leading experts, but it's the First Nations communities, the Inuit communities who are developing the program. It's their program, and we're helping them, and it's working.
Prime Minister, on the website, you say, the future of any society depends on its ability to nurture the healthy development of the next generation. So how do we launch the brilliant potential every child is born with? That's a marvelous challenge.
Well, and I'm so glad that you said it. And that is the issue that we face. And obviously, the Indigenous people in Canada face it, but we as countries face it. And in fact, with COVID and what's happening within our schools, we've got that challenge. Mm-hmm. But it is amazing to see how the Indigenous people have reacted and to see them take it over. And it's really important to understand this. We came to them with an idea. We stay there. We help, but it is their show.
Mm-hmm. And the results, and I get this from your website, but the results are already appearing. Better results in school, immunizations are up, child welfare is down. So congratulations to the Martin Family Initiative. I want to touch on a couple of other interests of yours, if I may, and of course our time is limited, but I'm particularly attracted to your commitment to global affairs. You were the chair of the Congo Basin Forest Fund, which addressed poverty issues in that 10-nation area of Africa. And you made this comment. You said, we can't continue to not address the massive poverty of the kind that exists in Africa, the continent with the youngest population in the world, yet the one that stands to be hit hardest on both climate change and the pandemic. Now, you said this before the current pandemic and early in the climate change realization, but I'd like you to just expand on that, because the significance of that is profound, that Africa has such a marvelous potential, and yet is vulnerable to the worst things that face mankind.
Well, to take a look at Africa, it is the continent with the largest and the youngest population in the world. What they need to do, and what I worked on very much when I was there, is a common market as between their countries. They are now in the process of doing that. And I can tell you that at some point, Africa is going to be a very powerful continent when they have essentially got that economic act together. But they have to bring in education. They have to bring in much better healthcare. They have to be able to deal with what we're seeing with COVID-19 as an example. But they are in the process of doing it. But what we really got to understand is that we can't just, as Canadians, can't just stand aside and watch this happen. We've learned, I hope now, fundamentally from COVID, that if we could solve COVID in our country, the Americans could solve COVID. But if the Africans don't, you can rest assured that 2 weeks later, you're going to have another typhoid, whatever it happens to be, another massive disease spread. And so we are one people in the world. We're not going, if we don't deal with COVID-19, and if we don't deal with the next massive disease spread that comes, this is the fourth major pandemic in the last 80 years. There are going to be others, and what we really got to be able to do is to stop them in their infancy. And the only way we're going to do that is if we work together. And then or climate change. I mean, what better opportunity, or what clearer example of our dependence on dealing with these issues? And that, so that when some countries, for instance, come along and say, well, we're going to defund the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is the organization that is going to establish the research work around the world, and it's going to take place in those places that need it. We are one people in this world. And those borders are not going to be able to prevent the bad things, nor are they going to allow us to do the good things.
I don't think we as Canadians recognize how profound the impact of COVID has been in Africa. I happen to chair a Canadian organization that supports a children's orphanage in Nairobi. And I'm also in touch with some people in Kenya, and they're devastated. I mean, they are absolutely housebound. They have curfews. There is no financial support. Everybody is just living hand to mouth. What we're going through here is a cakewalk compared to what the people of Africa are facing.
Well, good for you, Mr. Hacker, because the fact of the matter is, if they continue to go through that, they are not going to solve their problem. And if they don't solve their problem, we're going to have it.
We have limited time, and so I want to touch on climate change, because you made a speech to the Brock Convention earlier, the Brock University graduation convention earlier this year.
I must say.
Sorry?
You've done your homework.
Well, you said there, the nations of the world are inexorably linked. You said, we need to transition to a new economy.
Could you try again?
Siri wanted to become part of our conversation.
Oh, okay.
You said we need to transition to a new economy, one that has the environment written in its core.
Well, I think there are two reasons for that quite clearly, and I don't think I have to convince anybody watching that dealing with the environment is absolutely crucial if what we're going to do is to maintain the kind of society that we have. But I think we also have to recognize the phenomenal economic benefits that exist out there if you do. I mean, it's if you deal with the environment, renewable energy as an example, or any of the environmental issues that are out there, you're talking about a whole new raft of industries. You're talking about a whole new way of looking at things. There's no doubt in my mind that we are a country rich in natural resources, but one of those natural resources is the brains of our people, and our people have the capacity, I really do believe, to lead the world.
I will pass a compliment along to you. 2 weeks ago on this program, my guest was Elizabeth May, and she went out of her way to speak warmly of the contribution that you have made to the environment and to climate change. So I pass that along to you belatedly from her.
Well, I must say I would reciprocate by telling her that I have huge admiration for Elizabeth May. All of her life, I've known her a long time, and I must say that I think that she is one of the people who makes Parliament look good.
I agree with you. You mentioned pandemic preparation, and you have set out some guidelines for how to prepare for the next pandemic. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that, or if you'd like me to give you a couple of references.
Why don't you give me the references? I want to, otherwise I'll go on forever.
Okay, well, and I'm quoting you here, learning from what we're going through now. Are we doing that well?
I don't think we're learning it. I don't think we're learning it as well. I think we are learning a lot, but I think this attempt to defund the World Health Organization just makes absolutely no sense. I mean, I think the World Health Organization it needs a lot to make it go. But you know, the World Health Organization is treated almost as a charity. The country should be taxed to make sure that it does the research, that it stays on top of it. I mean, I think that there are some huge gaps, and I think that the attack on the WHO is one of them.
You made a comment at one point that national sovereignty will not work, and you've taken a global perspective on many things in what you've written and the speeches you've made. That kind of flies in the face of what we hear from that certain person to the south who wants to defund the WHO. Can you speak to the benefits of globalism?
Well, look, national sovereignty, I believe in national sovereignty, but national sovereignty cannot work unless it's shared. I mean, you can take climate change, take COVID, take any of these issues. The fact is that the most powerful countries in the world cannot deal with COVID-19 without the rest of the world participating, as we have seen. They cannot deal with the environment. As an example, I mean, if the most powerful country in the world says, "I want to clean the oceans off my shores," well, they can't do it unless the poorest nations in the world also clean the oceans that are off their shores. It's clear. And so, and this is, for Canada, this is important. I'll give you one example. With global warming affecting the Arctic the way it is, what we're really seeing is massive changes in the Arctic. And we are going to be affected by what other countries do. And if what we want to do is to preserve the Arctic and make it possible, you know, for the people who are living up there to earn their living and to do well, we're not going to do it if we just basically say that we can do it within the Arctic, because we can't. So what I'm saying is I believe in national sovereignty, but the only way that national sovereignty can work is if you're prepared to share it when things are beyond your capacity, and there's a lot more beyond the capacity of even the most powerful countries than they know.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we see trends going in absolutely the wrong direction. You said, and I quote, "Prevention comes in the form of collective action by way of global data sharing, universal reporting mechanisms, and international research." But what we see now are countries retreating, growing their borders, growing their boundaries, and every man for himself. How do we reverse that, Prime Minister?
I think that what we have to do is, that's where the G20 can play such an important role, and where I've talked about it. The fact of the matter is that the majority of the G20 countries would share the view that you have just expressed, and they understand that it's a couple of superpowers that right now are having a little trouble with it. But I think I think that, and what's got to happen is that the G20, and there is a meeting coming up, and the G20 has got to make it very clear that we cannot achieve what we're seeking to achieve. And you know the truth, nobody denies it. No, I mean, people in office sometimes trying to get elected, and I don't know why in God's name they do, will deny it. But I don't know of one legitimate scientist, political scientist, or whatever, who really thinks the world can do it on its own. Let me just say this. The most successful 80 years economically in the history of the world started in 1944-45, and really up until almost till now. And the fact, what was it? It's when they came together and they created the United Nations, they created the IMF, they created all of these international bodies. And they said these international bodies are going to basically help us make the economy work. What were they doing? They were sharing sovereignty. And it worked. And so if I was an American, as an example, I would look back and I'd say, my God, why did they give all of that power? Why did they share all that power? Well, they shared all that power so that the United States could become overwhelmingly the most powerful and the richest country in the world.
Yeah. Now, I have some viewers who wouldn't let me away with not asking you about your family. Can you tell us about your wife and your sons very briefly? And we just have a minute or so.
Well, Sheila and I have been married for 55 years. And the luckiest thing that ever happened to me, I can tell you that right now. I've got 3 sons, 2 of whom are married and have given us 5 grandchildren, 3 sons, 3 grandsons, and 3 granddaughters. So I've got great daughters-in-law. I've got great grandchildren, and I'm lucky as heck.
Oh, good for you. Well, I just want to thank the viewers who have joined us. I want to thank our Rogers TV technical support, the MCC staff who support us. I want to thank Kathy Bales and Michelle Deschamps for their continuing support of this program, Greg Rice for sponsoring this particular program, and the Right Honorable Paul Martin. It has been a complete delight for me to meet you, sir, albeit virtually, and I thank you for being part of this program.
Well, Mr. Hacker, I've had more fun than you can possibly believe. I just want to say thank you to you. I'm going to watch you all the time.
Well, thank you so much, and all the best.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.